Welcome to the 7th episode of the Ada Lovelace Day podcast. I'm Sue Charman-Anderson, and every month I talk to a woman in STEM about their work, as well as talking to women and men about historic and modern women's achievements, discoveries and inventions. Our podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of ARM, our exclusive semiconductor industry sponsor. You can find out more about ARM's energy-efficient microprocessor technology on their website at arm.com, and you can follow them on Twitter at ARM Holdings. And if you'd like to join ARM as a co-sponsor of our podcast, then please email me at suw@findingada.com. This month, psychological scientist Dr. Julia Shaw explains why we shouldn't trust our own memories, and how knowing that can help us develop a better relationship with our past. And bio-archeologist Dr. Brenna Hassett explores the lives and works of three pioneering archaeologists who have been instrumental in developing our understanding of prehistoric Turkey: Halet Çambel, Ufuk Esin, and Mihriban Özbaşaran. So this month I'm joined by Dr. Julia Shaw, who is a psychological scientist focused on applied memory research at London South Bank University. Hi Julia.
Hi.
Your work on applied memory research, can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so I like to call myself a memory hacker. And what I mean by that is that I intentionally, in my research, go into people's minds or memories and I change what they think they have experienced. So in particular, what I do is I convince people that they committed crimes that never happened. And this is part of a line of research called false memory research, where we try to create sort of alternative pasts that are particularly legally relevant.
How are these legally relevant?
So false memories are really important because if we think that we've experienced something that didn't actually happen either in that exact way, so let's say we forget someone's face and we think it was actually someone else who we saw at a crime scene, then that victim statement becomes useless and can actually lead to wrongful convictions. Similarly, if you think you have experienced an entire event, which can be a horrific experience as thinking that you've experienced or been the victim of a crime that didn't happen, or that you even potentially committed a crime. So in my research, I convince people that they committed assault with a weapon, or theft with police contact. And in those situations, again, it can lead to miscarriages of justice, because if you're confessing to these things or stating that these horrible things happened to you, it can go to court, people can be convicted, and people can land in jail who are actually innocent.
And how do you go about convincing people that they've committed a crime? I mean, I can imagine it must be a little bit more complicated than just going, don't you remember last Tuesday you committed a crime?
It is a little bit more complicated than that. So as a memory scientist, what I do is I build on what we know from neuroscience and what we know from other kind of more fundamental memory research, which essentially has convinced me, certainly, and suggests strongly that memory is association. So memory is a network in the brain. So brain cells are all connected to each other in a big web. This web is actually malleable. It can change, and we can lead it to change intentionally by asking leading questions in interview settings and by suggesting what's called misinformation. So information that's wrong to someone. So saying you did something that you didn't do. And given the right circumstances, by getting people to picture the event happening repeatedly and engaging in imagination exercises over multiple weeks, you can get someone to essentially confuse their memory with their imagination.
This sounds a lot like CSI, or one of these police dramas on TV. I mean, you often sort of see on TV and on police shows this idea of like how police interviews are done and false memories, and that does come up as a plot point. Do you think that they accurately portray the current understanding of how this works?
It's a little bit like CSI gone wrong, in that it's the work that I do, the memory research with sort of implanting these false memories, shows that a lot of the techniques that we see on TV, such as good cop, bad cop techniques, are horrible when it comes to accuracy of recall. And so what looks really compelling and convincing on TV, including in shows like CSI, is actually what I would consider worst practice when it comes to actual accurate memory retrieval.
Wow. And so once you've convinced someone that they've committed a crime, how do you unconvince them at the end of the study?
So as part of the convincing them process, what I do is I actually, so these are university students that participate in my research. They're about 20 years of age on average. And I, before they come in, ask them to fill out some contact details so that I could contact their parents. And what I do then is I send a questionnaire to the parents of my participants, and I ask them about important life events that happened to my participants when they were children and teenagers. And what I then get back, what I need to get back in order for the participants to qualify, is that they haven't done any of the things I want to implant, so that they've never committed a crime, and that they have experienced at least one real emotional event. And this is really important because this real emotional event allows me to gain their trust. And so in terms of sort of moving forward and getting them to actually be convinced that I can implant these that they actually committed this crime, they need to essentially not just trust me, but also trust that their parents said that this happened, even though, of course, I'm lying about it, which they don't know. So the way that I persuade them that they didn't commit the crime is that I say that their parents didn't actually tell me that this happened to them, that I made it up, that here's how memory works, that here are the reasons that it was very compelling to them. And I explain the process behind why memory is really flexible and how it's a creative reconstructive process that has lots of errors. And so my backup essentially for unconvincing them, as you said, that they haven't actually committed these crimes, is that I say that you can go talk to your parents and they will say that they have no idea what you're talking about because they didn't tell me this.
And how do they react to that?
I wish that I had ahead of time thought to film all the reactions. I only ended up filming the last few reactions, but they were quite priceless, really, because the reaction always was, no, what are you talking about? So some sort of indicator that there's surprise. And I actually also explicitly asked them, were you surprised later that this was a false memory study? And the surprise for some of them was sort of this blank stare in my direction of, what do you mean? But I have so many details, and I can hear things and smell things and see things and feel things in this memory that you're now telling me didn't happen, that we just worked for 3 weeks to get back. And I think that especially actually for those people who have those very complex false memories, that it's really an important life lesson for them to see, wow, my brain is capable of doing some pretty crazy things. And they can take that knowledge into every future situation involving memory and retrieval, and be armed with that knowledge, which I think is such a beautiful result of participating in scientific research.
Yeah, because I think we assume that our memories are these sort of fixed things, like a photograph on a film. And they're not at all, are they?
Yeah, I mean, the photograph analogy is sort of... I think most people sort of think that memory is like a photograph or a video. But then when you actually ask them what that means, they don't actually mean that in the permanent way that we typically think of videos or photos. So I think people realize, at the very least, that they forget stuff and that they get stuff wrong. But I think the extent to which our memories are creative and the extent to which our imagination can be confused with our memory is generally not acknowledged. And often until I think it happens to you, or until you realize that you've done something like that before, you might even reject the notion outright. So I think if you asked most people, do you think someone could convince you that you did something that never happened, or more specifically, that you committed a crime that never happened? I think most people would intuitively say, of course not. Of course I wouldn't buy that. And so that's where there's still education needed to show people, look, these things can be incredibly compelling and incredibly complex, and you don't know that they've happened.
And I think some of it as well has also got to be around the way we interpret our own memories. And I know, when I was preparing to move to the US a couple of years ago, I ended up going through a lot of old papers and notebooks, and it completely upturned a narrative that I'd formed in my mind about a certain part of my life. And And here was evidence that this narrative was completely false. And I did that without anyone else encouraging me or tinkering with my memories. I think it's quite easy to do.
It is quite easy to do. So sometimes I like to start talks. I give a lot of talks about sort of memory and memory hacking and why you can't trust your memories. I really take pleasure in going around and inducing existential crises in people I come in contact with. I have been referred to as evil before. I don't self-identify that way. I think the more you know about the complexities of how your brain works and how it doesn't, the more armed you are to deal with your brain and to use it to your advantage. With regards to what we were talking about, which was memory and narratives, yeah, we certainly, every day you essentially wake up a new person. And so this is because your brain is this beautiful, complex organ that as you sleep changes, that every time you experience anything changes, that as you're listening to this podcast is changing. And so it would be bonkers to assume that at any point you're the same person as you ever were, never mind that any particular memory is entirely accurate, even if it is a significant part of your identity, a significant part of your life narrative. So certainly, you don't need someone else to come in and tinker with your memories. You're doing it all on your own all the time anyways.
And it's important to remember that and the way that we think about our past. I mean, I've always said I have a rubbish memory. I would never write an autobiography because it would be 90% wrong. Mm-hmm. And I've always sort of felt a degree of distrust about my own memory skills, as it were. I mean, is this something that we can work on? Is there a way we can improve our memories? And I don't mean the whole kind of Mind Palace Sherlock Holmes thing, but just improve our relationship with our memories.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think for one, actually, your view of your own memory is probably more accurate than what many people think. So I think anyone who thinks they have an amazing memory, unless they're what's called an HSAM, so a highly superior autobiographical memory individual. So these are people who can remember incredible details of their own lives. So for example, you ask them what they ate for breakfast on January 1st, 1987, and they'll tell you what happened that day and what they did, maybe even what the weather was. So they have a level of autobiographical detail in their memory that just other people just don't have. But there's only about 130 of them that we've identified in the world. So you're probably not one of those people. And if you aren't one of those people, then you're probably just grossly overconfident in your own memory. And this is really important because I think that people assume that there's this strong relationship between confidence and accuracy for memory, also for any particular individual memory. And it's a spurious relationship at best. So we sometimes, yeah, sure, your confidence because you have more details or whatever is a reliable indicator, but it can just as easily be that you have a rich false memory, like in my research that I generate, that you are highly confident in as well, but that is demonstrably untrue and a complete piece of fiction. So confidence and accuracy have this sort of interesting relationship. I actually, so I wrote a book called The Memory Illusion, and in it, I have a whole chapter just on essentially overconfidence and memory and what it means, because I think it's so important.
I'm interested about these HSAM people with these amazing, sort of full, rich memories that they can accurately recall kind of what they had for breakfast 30 years ago, because I can barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Does this indicate that our memories are rich and that we have the capacity to remember everything? It's just that we can't access everything. Or do we actually shed memories? When we forget, do we forget permanently?
So there's a number of questions there. So the first one is sort of the HSAMs as to why can they remember better, right? That's the big question. And can we learn that, or can we harness that in some way for our own goals? And we don't really know. Let's start with that. We don't really know why HSAMs have much better memory than most people. We do know that a lot of them seem to keep journals. So a lot of them seem to place a sense of importance on their day-to-day activities, which probably you and I don't do. So you and I don't particularly take note of what we're having for breakfast, even as we're having the breakfast potentially. It's just not considered in important detail that we need to pay attention to, never mind that we should be storing for later use. And so I think attention is probably a really big part of this, and rehearsal. So they're paying attention to things that you and I don't pay attention to, things that you and I might even consider trivial. And they're rehearsing those trivial details over and over again, at the very least when they write it down, but possibly even more frequently. So that and their brains do seem to just work a little bit different. But in terms of harnessing that, I don't know that we'd want to. So HSAMs generally don't like being HSAMs. So generally, this is considered a curse, not a blessing. Partly because you remember conversations and things like that forever, so you remember the negative stuff that a lot of us lovingly like to forget in our rosy reminiscence. But they're also still prone to false memory, so you can still suggest wrong information to them, and they can still absorb that into this big framework. So they're not perfect even. And on top of that, what they lose is the attention that you and I are placing on other things, and the things that we're remembering that they're not remembering. Because you can't remember everything. You can't pay attention to everything that's happening. And so they're prioritizing trivial things, where maybe it's actually more adaptive overall to not prioritize those things, which is why most of us don't. Most of us think about concepts and more important life events.
And so your work has led you into the world of the expert witness in court. How does that work? I mean, are you being asked to give this kind of a discussion to a court and give them a grounding in memory, or do you focus more on the specifics of whichever case is in question?
Yeah, so I am an expert witness mostly for British cases right now. I do get asked to do the occasional American case, but almost exclusively British cases. And in the UK, unlike in the US and in some other countries, you're asked to be an educator of the court. So an expert witness, at least as I've been asked to be, and as experts generally are expected to be in the UK, you're not supposed to go in there and talk about what's referred to as the ultimate issue. And the ultimate issue is this person guilty or not? And or innocent or not, depending on how you want to frame that question. And so I refrain from talking about that. But what I do is I explain how fragile and malleable memory is. And then I can apply it to a particular case, but only to the sense that I look for red flags in the way that a memory was recalled. Because unfortunately, a true memory and a false memory look exactly the same. Even more unfortunately, a lie and a false memory generally look exactly the same. So it's impossible for me to know what's going on behind why this person is saying what they're saying, or whether or not it's accurate from the statement itself. But what I can do is I can go in and look at the process. So I can look at and see, has this person had suggestive interviewing? Has this person's story grown dramatically over time and changed dramatically over time in a way that's consistent with how we know that false memories grow? And in a setting like bad therapy, like hypnotherapy, where we know that these things are particularly likely to evolve. So that's what I do. So I go into courts and people shove a case in front of me and say, "What do you think, Dr. Shaw?" And I say, there are red flags here, or there aren't. But I never say this is or isn't a false memory.
That sounds like really quite fascinating work. You seem very, everyone that I talk to actually on the podcast loves what they do. You seem to really love what you do. I mean, what is it about memory that has attracted you and that has so fascinated you?
Oh my goodness. What doesn't fascinate me about memory? I mean, memory is so fundamental to who we think we are. In fact, I like that statement so much that that's the subtitle of the Canadian version of my book, Why You May Not Be Who You Think You Are. And I think that we have this sense of self that's based on all these things that we think we've experienced. All these people we know, these loved ones that we've had or currently have, in our interaction with the world. And this kind of research on autobiographical false memories, on memories that are important to our lives, really calls those into question, at least suggesting that perhaps some of them are either misled, and others might be completely wrong. So they might be complete fabrications. And I think that's a really interesting sort of way to shake at someone's foundational kind of assumptions about themselves. But it also comes with a freedom that, again, if you understand these processes, you can understand yourself better. You can understand your memory mistakes better and the memory mistakes of your loved ones. And you can also somewhat take it into your own hands. So at the end of the book, I talk about how essentially memory, I like to think of it as a paint by numbers, that you pick your own favorite past. If you've got multiple versions of a memory and you can't remember exactly which one, pick the nicest one, because who cares? It's all fabrication anyways. And the only thing that matters is who you are in the present and who you think you are in the present. So I like to sort of instruct people to craft their own past, craft their own reality, within reason, of course. But I find it hugely empowering.
Yeah, 'cause I think it can be very easy, depending on your personality. Some people do focus on maybe more negative memories than the positive ones. Or, maybe, it can be easy to sort of fixate on a particular part of your past. So it kind of makes a lot of sense to say, if our memories are flexible and they're not quite as pinned down as we like to think they are, then we should look at the best of what we've experienced. And that makes a lot of sense. And actually, this ties in with an essay that you wrote for the Scientific American last December, Swapping Princesses and Ponies for Science, which is a great title. But in it, you talk about how we need to sort of make more of a connection for teenage girls between what they can learn in the STEM fields and their own personal and professional growth. And you talk about how important that is, and that this is something that that we need to help girls see, and that would be something I'd very much agree with. And it seems that, to me, that belief must have grown out of your work.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that we need to empower people, be they women or otherwise, but especially women in science, I think is really important to me. And there's lots of different ways to empower people. But one way to attract and empower girls, I think, in the sciences is to construct a narrative that not only interests everybody, but also fits with how we, and this, I almost shudder saying this, but how we currently raise girls. And currently we raise girls more than boys, I think, to seek sort of self-exploration and to become better people as a whole. Whereas boys sometimes can be shoved into a utilitarian, go study something that's useful. And I think sometimes we undersell the sciences, the more practical sciences in particular, to girls because we're focusing so heavily not on how it can actually make you a more well-rounded person, how it can make you a better you, and we just focus on this will get you a job. And I think that does actually ostracize a lot of people who either weren't raised like that or don't have those kinds of priorities.
How do you think we can best reform this narrative around sort of personal and professional growth in STEM?
Well, for one, I like the idea of talking about sort of the journey of school and the journey of university, and talking about how it's a broad platform for all kinds of different growth, and it's and having leadership that reflects the diversity of women. So this is, again, something that sometimes I struggle with. I mean, I'm in social sciences. It's in the Department of Law and Social Sciences, and they currently rebranded our department. And guess what color they chose to rebrand our department as? Pink.
Oh, please no.
They chose bright pink for the social sciences. And all I could think was, what are you doing? We have the girls. With us, it's the opposite problem. So often depending on what kind of science you're doing, obviously, in psychology and in criminology and in other kinds of social sciences that have even the word social in them, right? It sounds more feminine. We seem to have, a problem where we're under-recruiting boys and we're over-recruiting women, which is the opposite problem, obviously, of other, quote, hard sciences, which I also consider a very gendered term. Soft and cuddly versus hard and manly. And I struggle with these words, but I also struggle with the campaigns that are used around recruiting women in particular into the sciences, or or not, because of these sort of gendered approaches to color schemes, to language, to role models. I mean, if you often will talk about a woman who has succeeded because she sort of defeated the odds, and only 1 in 10 female popular science writers are women, and look at this woman go. And not everybody wants to be a hero. I don't think every woman is going to go, yeah, let me sign up for that. I really want struggle. I think that can actually work to our disadvantage. And so I think, again, highlighting the narrative and the journey of sort of inclusiveness and not just struggle and hardship and we need more women, but you want to be part of this. You want this experience. This will be good for you, not just for society, I think is really important.
And I think as well, we focus a lot on what, as a scientist, you discover. And in this conversation, we've talked a lot about what you've learned about memory and how memory works. But your point of actually that as you study your subject, as you do your experiments, you learn about yourself as well, and that you grow as an individual. We rarely talk about that. And I agree with you. I think that we should talk about it a lot more. So I am going to ask you the million-dollar question. How has your work helped you grow personally?
The biggest thing any career in any science helps you do is it helps you ask why. So everything you approach, every idea you come into contact with, every new sort of preconceived notion that you might notice you have, any misguided belief, political decision-making, all kinds of avenues where you start asking, why do I think this? Why does this happen the way it does? Why do other people do these things? And instead of just accepting things as, well, that's the way it is, or that's the way I am, we question and we evaluate whether or not our decision-making and the decision-making of others is accurate. And in different sciences, you'll have different focuses, but regardless of what type of science, you get much better at evaluating logic, arguments. You get good at identifying non sequiturs, so when X doesn't follow from Y, you start identifying pseudoscience. All these things, I think, together really have helped me, certainly, to feel like even if I'm not more in control of my biases, at least I'm aware of them. And maybe I can understand why the world works the way it does a little bit more than people who haven't pursued a background in the sciences.
What a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Julia. This has been fascinating. It is a conversation I will attempt to remember accurately in future.
Great. Thank you so much.
If you'd like to read Swapping Princesses and Ponies for Science, the article Julia wrote for the Scientific American, then you can find that link in our show notes. We've also got a link to her book, The Memory Illusion, and a video where she explains how even your most cherished recollections could be false. So I'd like to welcome Dr Brenna Hassett, who is a bioarchaeologist most recently based at the Natural History Museum in London and also co-founder of the Trailblazers. So Brenna, before we start, can you tell me a little bit about what are the Trailblazers?
Well, Trailblazers, as you may have guessed from the name, are women who blazed trails with their trowels. So we're a strange little organization for early career scientists who basically got together to get angry about things on Twitter, because that is what Twitter is for. And one of the things we realized we were angry about is we all had these amazing stories of women who had kind of been inspiration in our field, who had been incredible sort of mentors or researchers. And their stories just never made it kind of into the larger public view. So we decided we would do what every other angry person on Twitter does. We would start a blog. And we kind of had this idea that we'd do about 4 posts or something, just a few little quick stories, and then we would be done. Little did we know that we had actually unleashed a monster. We had no idea how many hidden women there were in the history of science. We had no idea because they were hidden. Makes sense, I guess, when you look at it that way. But so we're a group of archaeologists and paleontologists, and we started off just hoping to kind of put up a couple pictures and a few jokey biographies and just sort of, let the world know that women have been in science a lot longer than you think. And this has sort of spawned into a website, Twitter feed, Facebook group, and it's kind of eaten our lives, but in a very good way over the last 3 years.
That's fantastic. And you're going to be talking about 3 trailblazers today. Who are you going to be talking about?
There are 3 women I'm going to talk about, mostly because their stories all link together. And I think one of the things that Trailblazers really wants to bring out is this idea that women don't exist as islands in science. Science loves that kind of myth of the great inventor, working long hours in the lab on their own. Genius is a sort of isolated, no-context experiment. But really, science happens through collaborations, through training, through role models, through mentorship. So the women I'm going to talk about all have a role to play in training and mentorship that's actually really personally important to me. So I'm going to talk about Halet Çambel, Ufuk Esin, and Mihriban Özbaşaran, who are all Turkish trailblazers.
Their stories all link together, but where do they start?
Let's start with Halet Çambel. Now, Halet Çambel is actually very famous in Turkey, and rightfully so. She comes from a sort of quite august family who were great friends with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, so the guy who founded modern Turkey. And her family was sort of intimately involved with the discussions and sort of processes that went along with that. So Halet went off to go study in Paris at the Sorbonne, as was done in the time, but she came back and pretty much founded archaeology at the University of Istanbul. Of course, that wasn't the first thing she does. One of the things that she's rather well known for, kind of the best story, is that Halet Çambel may be the closest thing to a swashbuckling Indiana Jones style archaeologist that we have.
Indiana Jones must be the bane of archaeologists around the world.
Pretty much. So one of the Trailblazers' missions is to sort of reset the imagination so that when you think about swashbuckling archaeologists, you think about Halet Çambel. In 1936, Halet Çambel went to the Olympics. She was an Olympic competitor in fencing. She is one of the first 2 Muslim women to ever compete in the Olympics.
She's a trailblazer and a trailblazer.
Exactly. So she went to Berlin in 1936. She competed for Turkey. She was offered the opportunity to meet their Führer and declined. She wasn't having any of that. And she came back to Istanbul after that. She actually ended up working with quite a lot of people who had fled Nazi Germany. And she really instigated sort of a program of archaeological excavations and archaeological training in Turkey. And she's remembered for her amazing contributions to environmental science. She was very big on conservation, but she's also remembered for a lot of her archaeological discoveries. She's the one who sort of found kind of equivalent of a Rosetta Stone for the Hittites, who are a huge culture in Turkey and very important archaeologically. And of course, one of the main contributions that she made is to train new generations. So one of these new generations in this new department that she'd started in Istanbul was Ufuk Esin. Now, Ufuk Esin came in and studied under Halet, but she had sort of, she was slightly disadvantaged from the start because she actually had childhood health problems. She had hole in her heart or a similar childhood ailment that kind of meant she was slightly more frail than what you think of your typical sort of robust, physical digger. But what she actually managed to do was organize quite a lot. She was very, very serious about her studies, and she was very, very serious about science. So when she couldn't go off to do these sort of big digs and things with Halet Çambel and her mentors because it was judged a little bit too much hard work for, a frail, quite short woman, she actually went off and studied archaeological science. And she had a Fulbright scholarship. And what she managed to do was really bring archaeological science to Turkey and to integrate it into digging, sort of before Ufuk Esin, there was quite a lot of the sort of old-style geology, if you know what I mean, sort of wandering around, pointing at things and describing them in incredible detail. But there wasn't a lot of what we now think of as archaeology, which is the science part, which is sort of taking apart pots and looking at their composition, measuring things, and really sort of a quite processual approach to doing archaeology. So what Ufuk managed to do was to sort of transmit this idea that science could be brought into archaeology. And when she finally got her own sites to dig, she carried this idea with her. Now, of course, the other contribution that she's made is training people. Training is one of the sort of most useful things you can do because it brings up the next generation. And the next generation in this case is Professor Mihriban Özbaşaran, who is a professor of prehistory at Istanbul University and is a wonderful human being who is actually my dig director. So Mihriban has been an incredibly helpful presence in my own research. So I went off in sort of the late 2000s to go and look at the archaeology of a site called Işıklıhoyuk. Işıklıhoyuk is in the center of Anatolia, and it's old. It's very old. It's like 10,000 years. It's old. And it's one of the very first sort of settled villages in the world. It's kind of the very beginning of humans' experiments with settling down, with cultivating crops, and it's a really, really important archaeological site. A lot of people will have heard of Çatalhöyük, which is a little ways away. This is earlier, and therefore better, obviously. But it's all about earlier is better in archaeology. That's one of our things. The site is run by Mihriban, and she's managed to integrate kind of this scientific approach with a really sort of integrated modern theoretical approach. And it's really one of the only projects in Turkey which isn't necessarily a sort of collaboration with all sorts of international participants, but that's really sort of bringing in theoretical scientific perspectives and training the next generation of Turkish archaeologists. Of course, international collaborators do get to come, and they are very generously treated by Professor Özbaşaran. But it's amazing to think that my research on the site of Işıklıhoyuk, looking at dead kids' teeth, because that's what I do, is influenced through really 3 generations of amazing women, going back to the founding of the Turkish Republic itself. These are stories that Trailblazers brings out, and you never realize until, you look at the whole lineage, how much it affects your own career as a scientist.
And I think their stories are really interesting for 2 reasons. The first one being that it's not often in science we see this kind of lineage with women. We see this master and student scenario with men all the time, but women are often isolated within their science community. But it does seem that there's actually a broad network of women in archaeology, so a woman being trained by a woman is not unusual.
That's pretty true. Archaeology, paleontology, geology, like other sciences, we do suffer from a lack of women role models and a lack of women mentors generally. And part of that is the sort of standard problem that women, until very recently, really weren't allowed to get to the top of the professional ladder where they were in a position to be mentors. But I think the really interesting thing with field sciences, where you have jobs that essentially require you to have experience and knowledge, but not necessarily a sort of formal academic criteria, we see a lot of women who are incredibly important as mentors, as teachers. You see it with Mortimer Wheeler's wife, Tessa Verney Wheeler, who was incredibly influential in UK archaeology. She was the one who sort of trained up generations of students. But of course, her name is not the one on the gold plaque on the wall. It should be, but we're working on that.
These women are there and they were influential, but they're not given the recognition that they deserve.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Trailblazers really wants to pull out is this sort of, this occasionally very gender stereotyped idea of what counts in science. And I think we've seen it a lot with sort of recent trends for bringing out, the first computers. They were actually women running numbers. And, it's the same in many of the fields. There's a lot of the grunt work, a lot of the boring bits that is actually doing science are done by women. But they're women who aren't considered professional because they leave the field when they get married, or because they're not allowed to join the university, or any other number of excuses. But there's actually an incredible amount of work that's being done sort of behind the scenes. And it's being lost, dismissed, what have you, because those aren't the names on the papers and those aren't the names on the press releases.
So I wanted to go back as well to the point you made about Ufuk Esin bringing in a more scientific view of archaeology.
Ah, yes. Well, this is a ongoing challenge in archaeology, is to get adherents of all three of those schools to sit nicely in a room together. So this is a challenge, and actually I think Ashiklohoik might be one of the places where it seems to work best. There's a lot of pressure sort of to, archaeology is supposed to be there to explain the human experience. So you get a sort of constant fight between making kind of big universal statements about what it was like to live in the past or how human societies developed. Then you get people who sort of have a bunch of data, and that data sort of says one thing or the other. Data, it turns out, fairly strict on some of these subjects. And it can only be refuted with more data. So you get people who sort of say, no, we have to look to the data and we have to use that, and everything else is a little bit wishy-washy. And then you get people who go, well, all your numbers are well and good, but it doesn't really allow you to talk about the human experience of the past and how individual people make individual decisions based on who they are, what they are in society, what roles they play. So taking all of that and feeding it back in together is a complicated process that I don't think anyone's really got right, but each one of those steps has been sort of incremental in building up the science of archaeology as we know it today. I'm a little bit more on the science side because I do things like laser ablate teeth for a living, but I can see the value in some of the other bits.
And it seems to me that having this sort of lineage of Halet Çambel, who was in the field, and you're sort of swashbuckling Indiana Jones, and then Ufuk Esin, who's more scientific, and then sort of coming into the modern day with Mihriban Özbaşaran about being more theoretical, that this is sort of, it's a nice sort of development about how the science has expanded and developed over the last sort of almost 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that really sort of, if you look at Mihriban's work today, she's got the swashbuckling down. She drives out to site in a big old Jeep for years and years. Her wonderful dog Dino accompanied her. And then, she also has incredible scientific specialists, both from her department and coming in from abroad. Big National Science Foundation funded projects, my own work, and lots of really high-tech stable isotope studies and things like that. And she's integrating all of them. And I think that's kind of, that's built on this lineage that she's been able to access. I think she was actually taught by both Halet and Ufuk at some point, or at least Halet was head of department when Ufuk was teaching and Mihriban was taking lessons from her. So presumably some of that rubbed off on her.
And of course, when we think about archaeology, our exposure to it is through programs like Time Team. So we do have a tendency, I think, to sort of, in the popular conscious, slightly privilege the digging things up and go, oh, look, here's a pot. And I think that maybe isn't entirely fair on the other aspects of archaeology. It seems to me, sort of like trying to think of this a little bit more objectively, that actually to bring the scientific and the theoretical into a field where the people who get all the publicity are the people who go, oh, look, I found a pot. That's quite challenging, and that's quite a significant achievement in and of itself, even if maybe a slightly invisible one.
Yeah, and I think, one of the goals of my life is really to bring a little bit more fairness to that process, and to point out that there are a lot of people making incredible contributions to science, and it does seem like, rather unfortunately, a lot of the ones whose names do not get put up in spotlights are the women. But they are there, they are doing incredible science, and you just have to look for them.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, Brenna. It's been really interesting.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was very fun to chat.
Brenna has a book out next year called Built on Bones, which is out in February on Bloomsbury Sigma. And that's about, apparently, all the horrible things that living in cities has done to our bodies over the last 15,000 years, which sounds like a really, really good read. Now, the Trailblazers contributed a chapter for our first book, A Passion for Science, and you can read an excerpt of that on our website. You need to look for A Splendid Regiment of Women, which looks at 20th century archaeologists and paleontologists. And as ever, the links to that are in our show notes. Thanks to Julia and Brenna for talking to us this month. If you want to find out more about them and their work, just visit our website at findingada.com/EP7. We've got a video from Julia about memory and information about Raising Horizons, the Trailblazers' latest project to promote women in the trowel-based sciences. Thanks again to our sponsor, ARM, for their ongoing support. If you'd like to join them as a podcast sponsor, please do get in touch. Thanks also to our editor, Andrew Marks. If you want our latest episodes delivered automatically to your door, then you should subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Links are in the show notes. And if you'd like to send us feedback about the show, or if you'd like to take part, you can email me at sue@findingada.com. Next month, we'll be talking to Dr. Ray Robertson Anderson about biological soft matter and biomaterials. And we'll be chatting to ecologist Dr. Thorin Helgeson about her STEM heroines. So don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook to be the first to know when our next episode is published. See you next month.